Hi everyone, May Finlay here, and this is your last lecture. This week we're talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health policy. So before we start, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we're all meeting on today and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm here on Wadi Wadi country and it is Sunday and it is an overcast day and it's not too bad actually. I don't mind it on a Sunday when it's like this. It really makes me just feel like relaxing. I'd like to also pay my respects to elders past and present, extend that respects to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the line, and also to everyone else. Thank you for joining us for this last lecture. I know that you will be putting together your final essay for us, and we're looking forward to reading them. So this lecture covers a number of things, but the first part of the lecture is actually going to be a crash course in policy. The second part will be looking at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander historical context around policy. And then for the last part, we're going to be focusing on close the gap and closing the gap. So that's kind of where we're going with this particular lecture. But now we're going to be looking at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, well, consultation more generally before we move on to the specifics. So right down the bottom of the screen, and I'm just going to use my annotate for the first time, you can see, oh no, that didn't work. Ignore that. So right down the bottom of the screen where you can see the pointer is identify issues. Now, this is known as the policy cycle, and that's often where policy begins. It's not always where it begins though. Sometimes it can begin with decisions, so a minister will come out with an announcement. Sometimes it'll be a part of an evaluation where a position is identified and that will then become the new policy. Sometimes through consultation, policy and issues are identified that hadn't been considered. But we're going to start with identifying issues. So let's start with rheumatic heart disease. You know, through the case studies you've done in the early parts of the subject, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are more likely to have rheumatic heart disease than other Australians. So what that means is that that's the issue. We need to reduce the rate of rheumatic heart disease. What we know with rheumatic heart disease is it's caused by acute rheumatic fever, which is caused by Streptococcus A, otherwise known as gas, and it is basically strep throat, a version of strep throat. And what it does is over repeated infections, it can damage the heart. Now, what we also know from the issue is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and acute rheumatic fever and rheumatic heart disease is strongly influenced by social determinants of health. We know largely it is about housing and it's about education, and education being around health education, not formal context of education. Now, the next step is the policy analysis. So this will be looking at almost doing like a literature review. What's in the space currently? What do we know about the issue? What do we know about the prevention? So when we're thinking about prevention, it could be making sure that everybody's going to be primordial prevention, making sure everyone's houses are good, that they're not overcrowded, that they have sanitation. Then there's the secondary prevention, say for rheumatic heart disease, which is an injection of penicillin every 28 days intramuscular. That will actually mean that it will reduce the likelihood of you getting acute rheumatic fever again. And that injection lasts for 10 years. Then what they're going to be looking at is, so we know now what the issues are, we know the policy context more broadly. We now need to look at the policy instruments. So the policy instruments are things like guidelines, frameworks, legislation. Do we need to legislate something here? Probably not. Do we need to create guidelines around how to actually treat acute rheumatic fever and rheumatic heart disease? Absolutely. Do we need to consider the national partnership agreements around housing to reduce the likelihood of people getting it in the first place? Possibly. And that's where all of the questions are raised as well, is in the next stage, which is consultation. Now, consultation should, when it's done well, actually consider all perspectives on this and bring in all of the different evidence from all of the stakeholders. So stakeholders could be governments themselves and government departments. It could also be for-profit and not-for-profit organisations, such as the ACCHO sector. It could be pharmaceutical companies if we're talking about for-profit. So if you're thinking about creating a vaccination as part of a multi-pronged strategy to address rheumatic heart disease, which also includes reducing housing and making sure that health professionals are educated around rheumatic heart disease and acute rheumatic fever and trained on giving the intramuscular injection, if you're thinking about a vaccination on top of it, you need to consult the pharmaceutical companies around that. Then it's the coordination. So thinking about what players need to actually then be involved in implementing this and thinking about all of the mechanisms. You then have a decision. So what is the decision? So around acute rheumatic fever, there have been national guidelines which the government funded. There has also been an investment in a vaccination for streptococcal A, otherwise known as GAS, which is the strep throat, as you remember, that then actually the virus migrates to the heart and damages the heart valves. So they're looking to actually do that, make sure that they're coming up with a vaccination, but they're also done a whole range of other things. So there's a range of decisions in this particular policy. Then it's the implementation. Then it's implemented, and if it's done in a way and considered to be best practice, an evaluation framework will be developed right at the beginning alongside of the implementation framework. And an evaluation is designed to do exactly what you probably think it does, which is to see what's working and what's not working. Now, we also know that sometimes if you know something's not working before the evaluation's complete, your best practice would be to change it or think about changing it. There is no point getting 12 months, 24 months into a policy when you knew within the first 2 months something wasn't working before you make changes. So make them early. So that's kind of a crash course in the policy cycle. If you are interested in policy, you can of course go and pick up this. This is the 4th edition. Pretty sure there might be a new edition. If not, this one is still really valid. I'm a bit of a policy nerd. I love policy. Now, why do I love policy and why do I think everyone should get excited about policy? The reason is because whether you realize it or not, it guides almost everything that you do. So when we're looking at, if you're a GP, for example, it guides what tests you can actually claim under the Medicare benefit scheme. It also guides what medications you can offer at a subsidised rate through the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, and both of those are legislated. When thinking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health policy, it also means where money is invested. So when we're thinking about closing the gap, which we're going to talk about later, there are a range of different priorities areas, and underneath those is where the money goes. So policy may not be sexy for very many people, but ultimately, whether you realise it or not, it governs your life. Seatbelts are a public health initiative that's been legislated. COVID, much of it has not been legislated. There is privacy legislation being introduced around the COVID Safe app, but the stay-at-home policies have not been legislated, but they're certainly still enforceable. So you really need to understand policy if you want to have an influence at a state or national level. Now, let's just talk about the healthcare system. So the healthcare system, you've seen this before, is where policies are generally made. Now, I did say there were for-profit organisations which will be included in this, and you absolutely need to think about them, and this is not actually included in this. When I'm talking about for-profit, for example, when we're thinking about regulating alcohol. So let's take the lockout laws in New South Wales, which were introduced a couple of years ago in Sydney to reduce alcohol-fueled violence, which largely was around the King's Cross area. You also had people that had businesses in the area, cafes, bars, pubs, clubs, all actually a part of the consultation process because of their business and their livelihoods were going to be impacted. But then you also had obviously public health people, GP, hospitals, a whole range of things. So it was quite wide. And that was initiated by state government after lobbying actually from the healthcare sector. So these are all the key players. So you'll have, sometimes it'll be introduced by Australian Parliament or a state territory parliament, or it could be a policy that's suggested by one of the government departments, like Prime Minister and Cabinet or the Department of Health, or it could actually be introduced as an idea by a minister. Likewise, it can also come from the bottom up, so coming from the healthcare sector, or it could also come from the for-profit sector. So I won't go into detail about this, but I do actually want to make a little note on this one. So you see right in the middle of there is the Council of Australian Governments. So Scott Morrison's made an announcement that the Council of Australian Governments will be no more. What they're actually replacing it with is the National Cabinet, which has been formed to deal with COVID-19 pandemic. So that's been so successful that they're introducing that to replace the Council of Australian Governments. What that looks like and what it means, we don't know. I would imagine what it means in the short term is a slowdown in processes of new policies being introduced that are not specifically related to COVID. Outside of that, have no idea, and I'm really interested in watching this space. So the next part's going to be about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history of policy. So that's going to be a crash course, because we know that policy, very rarely policies are created from scratch. They're influenced by previous policies. So that's a really important thing to understand. All right, thanks. Bye.